November 12th, Oakhaven County. 17-year-old Jamel Hendrix sat at the defense table, his posture perfect, his expression one of bored superiority. For Jamel, this was not justice. It was an act. He viewed the courtroom as a laboratory where he was the only one with the correct formula. Charged initially with a tragic oversight following the natural deaths of his parents, Jamel played the role of the grieving scholar, convinced that his parents' deaths would be ruled a biological fluke. He had spent months refining a toxin he believed was invisible to the modern world. But he underestimated the persistence of a suspicious coroner. A single mass spectrometry report, Exhibit 7B, would destroy his calculated facade. By the time Judge Thorne spoke his name for the last time, the performance would be over, and the prodigy would be revealed as a cold-blooded chemist. The courtroom in Oakhaven County's Superior Court was built in the 1970s, all dark wood paneling and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a sickly yellow cast. Jamel sat in his orange jumpsuit, the white undershirt visible at the collar, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He had arranged his face into an expression of patient suffering, like a martyr awaiting vindication. To his right sat his attorney, Marcus Brennan, a public defender in his 50s with thinning hair and the weary look of a man who had defended too many guilty clients. Jamel adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and glanced at the jury box. 12 ordinary people, he thought. None of them would understand the elegance of what he had accomplished. They would see only the surface, the crude facts, never the artistry beneath. He felt a familiar contempt rising in his chest, but suppressed it. He needed to appear humble, grieving, innocent. Judge Ronald Thorne entered the courtroom, his black robes swishing as he climbed to the bench. Thorne was in his mid-60s, with a lined face and sharp grey eyes that missed nothing. He had presided over criminal cases for 30 years and had developed an instinct for deception. As he looked down at Jamel Hendrix, he felt a cold disquiet. There was something wrong about the boy's composure, something performative. The arraignment began with the clerk reading the charges. Jamel Hendrix was charged with 2 counts of negligent homicide in the deaths of his parents, Robert and Catherine Hendrix, who had died within hours of each other 3 months prior. The charges were preliminary, pending further investigation. The district attorney's office had filed them to prevent the case from going cold while forensic results were still pending. The prosecutor was a woman named Elena Vasquez, 38 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and the focused intensity of a predator. She had reviewed the case files a dozen times, and something about the deaths had troubled her from the beginning. 2 healthy adults in their early 50s do not simply drop dead of simultaneous heart failure without an external cause. Judge Thorne asked for the plea. Jamel stood, his movements precise and controlled. "Not guilty, Your Honor." He paused, then added, "And if I may, I believe the proper medical terminology for the condition my parents suffered from is arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. Not merely acute cardiac arrest, as stated in the preliminary death certificates. The distinction is medically significant." There was a beat of silence. Several jurors exchanged glances. Marcus Brennan closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. Elena Vasquez made a note on her legal pad, underlining it twice. Judge Thorne looked at Jamel with an expression that gave nothing away. "Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Hendrix. Your plea of not guilty is entered into the record. He set a trial date and dismissed the arraignment. As Jamel was led out of the courtroom, he allowed himself a small smile. He had established himself as knowledgeable, scientific, credible. The jury would remember that. But Elena Vasquez was already thinking about the 911 call. She had listened to it a dozen times. Jamel's voice had been calm, almost clinical, as he reported that both his parents appeared to be in cardiac arrest. There had been no panic, no emotion, just a detached recitation of symptoms. Heart rate absent, pupils fixed and dilated, no respiratory effort, like he was reading from a textbook. The investigation had begun the day the Hendrixes died. It was a Sunday afternoon in August, unseasonably hot. The call had come in at 4:17 in the afternoon. Paramedics had arrived at the Hendrix home, a modest two-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood, to find Jamel performing CPR on his mother in the living room. His father was on the kitchen floor, already cold. The paramedics had tried to resuscitate both victims, but it was too late. They were pronounced dead at the scene. The bodies were transported to Oakhaven County Hospital, where the attending physician, Dr. Philip Marsh, had performed a preliminary examination. Both victims showed signs of acute cardiac failure, but there were other symptoms that troubled Marsh. Discoloration of the extremities, unusual rigidity, a strange chemical odor he could not quite identify. Marsh had ordered toxicology screens, but the standard panel had come back negative. No alcohol, no common drugs, no obvious poisons. The death certificates were signed, listing acute cardiac arrest as the cause, pending further investigation. But Dr. Marsh was not satisfied. He had called Detective Sarah Hunt, an investigator with the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Department, who specialized in suspicious deaths. Hunt was a woman in her early 40s, with short cropped hair and the relentless energy of someone who did not know how to quit. She had arrived at the hospital morgue and studied the bodies herself. "Something is wrong here," she had told Marsh. "Two people, same age, same household, dying within an hour of each other. That does not happen naturally." Marsh had agreed. He had preserved tissue samples, hair follicles, and bone marrow specimens, and sent them to a federal forensic laboratory in Virginia that specialized in exotic toxicology. The testing would take months, but it was the only way to be certain. Meanwhile, Hunt had begun investigating Jamel. She had interviewed neighbors, reviewed financial records, searched the Hendrix home. What she found had been deeply disturbing. The trial began 3 weeks after the arraignment. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curious onlookers. The Hendrix case had captured local attention. A teenage genius accused of killing his parents. It had all the elements of a sensational story. Elena Vasquez stood to deliver her opening statement. She walked slowly to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this case is about a young man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. Smarter than his parents, smarter than the police, smarter than the medical examiners. Jamel Hendrix is undoubtedly intelligent. But intelligence without conscience is not genius. It is monstrosity." She outlined the prosecution's case. The evidence would show that Jamel had deliberately poisoned his parents using a rare synthetic isotope he had stolen from the university laboratory where he worked as an intern. The poison was designed to mimic natural heart failure, invisible to standard medical tests. But Jamel had made one mistake. He had underestimated modern forensic science. Marcus Brennan delivered the defense opening with less enthusiasm. He argued that the deaths were a tragic coincidence, the result of an undiagnosed genetic heart condition. Jamel was a devoted son who had tried desperately to save his parents. The prosecution's case was built on suspicion and circumstantial evidence, not proof. Jamel sat perfectly still during the opening statements, his face a mask of calm attention. Occasionally, he would take notes in a leather-bound notebook, his handwriting small and precise. When the cameras swung toward the defense table, he would rest his chin on his hand, mimicking the pose of Rodin's thinker. It was a calculated gesture, designed to project intellectualism and contemplation. The prosecution called its first witness, a family friend named Margaret Holloway. Margaret was a woman in her 60s who had known the Hendrix family for 20 years. She took the stand nervously, her hands trembling slightly. Elena Vasquez asked her to describe Jamel's relationship with his parents. Margaret spoke warmly of the family, describing Robert and Catherine as kind, gentle people who had supported their son's academic pursuits. Jamel was always so dedicated to their health, she said. He was constantly checking their blood pressure, taking their temperatures, monitoring what they ate. He said he wanted to keep them healthy. The words sounded innocent, but Vasquez let them hang in the air. Constantly monitoring, taking measurements, like subjects in an experiment. On cross-examination, Brennan tried to paint Jamel's behavior as filial devotion. Is it not admirable that a teenage boy cared so much about his parents' well-being? Margaret hesitated. It was admirable, but sometimes it felt... She paused, searching for the word. Clinical. The next witness was a neighbor, Thomas Chen, who lived 2 doors down from the Hendrixes. Chen was a retired postal worker with a keen eye for detail. He testified that 2 days after the funeral, he had seen Jamel in the kitchen of the Hendrix home, wearing a full hazmat suit and bleaching the floors. Vasquez asked, "Did that strike you as unusual?" "Very," Chen said. "I mean, the man had just lost both parents. Most people would be grieving, not scrubbing floors in protective gear." Brennan objected, arguing that grief manifests differently in different people. Maybe Jamel was cleaning as a way to cope. Judge Thorne allowed the testimony, but instructed the jury to weigh it appropriately. But the image had been planted. A teenage boy in a hazmat suit, eliminating evidence. The local coroner, Dr. Raymond Fields, took the stand next. Fields was an older man, nearing retirement, and he appeared uncomfortable. He admitted that the deaths had been unusual, highly unusual, in fact, but his equipment at the county hospital had been insufficient to identify any exotic toxins. Vasquez pressed him. "Dr. Fields, in your 30 years as a coroner, have you ever seen 2 people from the same household die of simultaneous cardiac arrest with no prior history of heart disease?" Fields shifted in his seat. "Number 1, I have not." "And did that concern you?" "Yes. That is why I referred the tissue samples to the federal lab." The prosecution introduced receipts showing that Jamel had purchased high-end chemistry equipment in the months before his parents' deaths. A precision scale capable of measuring micrograms, a vacuum distillation apparatus, chemical-grade glassware. The receipts totaled over $3,000, paid for with money from Jamel's summer internship. Jamel watched the receipts being entered into evidence with a slight frown. He leaned toward Brennan and whispered, loud enough for nearby jurors to hear, "Those were for my independent research project. perfectly legitimate. But the jurors were beginning to look at him differently. The mask of the grieving son was starting to slip. Detective Sarah Hunt took the stand on the third day of trial. She was a compelling witness, direct and unshakable. She described her investigation in meticulous detail: the scene at the Hendrix home, the interview with Jamel, the search of his bedroom. Vasquez asked, "Detective Hunt, what did you find in the defendant's bedroom?" Hunt pulled out a photograph showing Jamel's desk. It was covered with textbooks on toxicology, organic chemistry, and pharmacokinetics. There was also a leather notebook, which Hunt had seized as evidence. "Tell the jury about that notebook," Vasquez said. Hunt opened the evidence bag and removed the notebook. She handled it carefully, as if it were contaminated. This notebook contains detailed observations of two subjects, labeled Subject A and Subject B. The entries span 3 months, from May to August. They document heart rates, blood pressure readings, pupil dilation, skin discoloration, and behavioral changes. Did the defendant identify who Subject A and Subject B were? Not explicitly, but the timing corresponds exactly with the period leading up to his parents' deaths, and the symptoms described match the symptoms his parents exhibited before they died. The courtroom was silent. Hunt read from the notebook, her voice steady. June 15th. Subject A shows increased fatigue and confusion. Heart rate elevated to 105 beats per minute at rest. Subject B exhibits tremors in the hands. Both subjects complain of nausea. Adjusting dosage. The last 2 words landed like a bomb. Adjusting dosage. Jamel's face flushed red. He leaned toward Brennan and hissed, "That was a biology project. Theoretical modeling. She is taking it out of context." Brennan stood. "Your Honor, I object. The prosecution is mischaracterizing a student's academic notes." Judge Thorne looked at Vasquez. "Do you have evidence linking these notes to the victims?" Vasquez nodded. "We will establish that link through subsequent testimony, Your Honor." "The objection is overruled. Proceed." Hunt continued reading. August 10th. Subject A near complete organ failure. Subject B unresponsive to verbal stimuli. Experiment concluding as predicted. Success. The word success echoed through the courtroom. Several jurors looked physically ill. Jamel gripped his notebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was not going according to plan. He had thought the notebook was secure, hidden in a locked drawer. The police had no right. The next witness was Dr. Amanda Cross, the family physician who had treated Robert and Catherine Hendrix for 15 years. Dr. Cross was a composed woman in her late 50s, with the calm authority of someone who had seen everything. She testified that the Hendrixes had been in excellent health before their sudden decline. Vasquez asked, "Dr. Cross, did you notice any changes in your patients in the months before they died?" "Yes," Dr. Cross said. "Starting in late May, both Robert and Catherine began complaining of unusual symptoms: fatigue, nausea, muscle weakness, confusion. I ran standard blood tests, but everything came back normal. I thought perhaps they were experiencing stress." "Did you ever suspect poisoning?" Dr. Cross hesitated. In retrospect, the symptom progression was consistent with heavy metal poisoning, but the standard toxicology panels were negative, so I ruled it out. Vasquez introduced a video taken by Catherine Hendrix on her phone just 2 weeks before she died. In the video, Catherine looked frail and disoriented. She was trying to record a message for her sister, but kept losing her train of thought. Her hands shook visibly. In the background, Jamel's voice could be heard. "Mom, you need to rest. Let me help you." The video was devastating. The jury watched a vibrant woman reduced to a shadow, and they heard Jamel's voice, solicitous and calm, guiding her like a shepherd leading a lamb to slaughter. The prosecution built its case methodically. They called Jamel's internship supervisor from the university, Professor Leonard Graves. Graves was a distinguished chemist in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and a formal manner. He testified that Jamel had interned in his radiochemistry lab during the summer. Vasquez asked, "Professor Graves, did anything unusual happen during Mr. Hendrix's internship?" Graves looked uncomfortable. "Yes, during Jamel's final week, a vial of synthetic thallium-201 went missing from our secure storage. Can you explain what thallium-201 is?" Graves nodded. Thallium-201 is a radioactive isotope used in cardiac imaging. It is also highly toxic. In our lab, we use a synthetic variant that has a unique molecular signature. The isotope does not exist in nature. It can only be produced in a laboratory setting. And this vial went missing? Yes, I reported it to campus security, but nothing came of it. The assumption was that it had been misfiled or improperly logged. Did you suspect the defendant? Graves hesitated, then said, "I had no proof. But Jamel was the only intern with access to that particular storage unit during that week." Jamel could not contain himself. He stood halfway out of his seat and said loudly, "The man cannot even keep an inventory. He is incompetent." Judge Thorne slammed his gavel. "Mr. Hendrix, you will remain silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Jamel sat down, his face red, his composure cracking. Brennan tried to salvage the situation on cross-examination. "Professor Graves, you have no direct evidence that my client took this vial, correct?" "No direct evidence," Graves admitted. "And it is possible that the vial was simply lost or misplaced?" "It is possible, but unlikely. Our inventory controls are rigorous. But you cannot say with certainty that Jamel Hendrix took it." "No, I cannot." But the damage was done. The jury had heard about a missing toxin, and they had seen Jamel lose his temper. The prosecution introduced financial records showing that Robert and Catherine Hendrix had planned to cut off Jamel's university funding. They had been concerned that he was too isolated, too focused on academics at the expense of normal social development. They wanted him to take a gap year, to work, to interact with people his own age. Vasquez introduced emails between Jamel and his father. The tone was cold, clinical, and occasionally venomous. In one email, Jamel wrote, "You are limiting my potential. You do not understand the significance of my work. If you withdraw your support, you will regret it." The final sentence hung in the air. "You will regret it." Jamel sat motionless, staring at the screen where his own words were displayed. He had written those emails in frustration, never imagining they would be used against him. As the trial moved into its second week, the defense presented its case. Brennan called medical experts who testified about rare genetic heart conditions. He tried to create reasonable doubt, to suggest that the Hendrixes had died of natural causes that simply had not been diagnosed. But the prosecution had saved its most devastating evidence for last. On the 10th day of trial, Elena Vasquez stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Simon Albright. Dr. Albright was a federal toxicologist, a tall man in his 60s with a graying beard and the patient demeanor of a teacher. He worked at the National Institute of Forensic Sciences in Virginia, and he had spent 3 months analyzing the tissue samples from Robert and Catherine Hendrix. Vasquez began her examination slowly, methodically. Dr. Albright, can you explain to the jury what mass spectrometry is? Albright nodded. Mass spectrometry is a technique that allows us to identify the precise molecular composition of a substance. We can detect elements and compounds at incredibly small concentrations, down to parts per billion. More importantly, we can identify the unique signature of synthetic compounds. Why is that significant? Because synthetic compounds often have isotopic ratios that do not occur in nature. It is like a fingerprint. We can tell not just what the substance is, but where it came from. The courtroom was silent. Every juror was leaning forward. Vasquez continued. Dr. Albright, did you perform mass spectrometry analysis on tissue samples from the victims? Yes, we analyzed hair follicles, bone marrow, and organ tissue from both Robert and Catherine Hendrix. And what did you find? Albright pulled out a folder containing graphs and charts. We found significant concentrations of a synthetic isotope of thallium-201. The isotopic signature matched the unique variant produced in the radiochemistry lab at the university where the defendant worked. Vasquez approached the witness stand. Dr. Albright, can you explain what that means in plain language? Albright turned to face the jury. It means that both victims were poisoned with a man-made toxin that only exists in one place, the laboratory where Jamel Hendrix was an intern. This is not a substance that occurs naturally. It cannot be purchased. It can only be synthesized in a specialized lab, and the molecular signature is as unique as a fingerprint. Vasquez had a large screen set up in the courtroom. She displayed Exhibit 7B, the mass spectrometry report. The graph showed a massive spike at a specific molecular weight, a jagged peak that dominated the chart. Dr. Albright, can you explain this graph to the jury? Albright stood and walked to the screen. This spike represents the synthetic thallium-201 variant. The height of the spike indicates the concentration. In both victims, we found lethal levels of this isotope in their bone marrow. Bone marrow is particularly useful for toxicology because it preserves substances long after they leave the bloodstream. How long would it take for this toxin to kill someone? That depends on the dosage. Based on the concentrations we found, the victims were likely exposed to small doses over a period of weeks or months. The toxin accumulates in the body, causing progressive organ failure that mimics natural disease. It is a particularly insidious method of poisoning because standard tests do not detect it. Jamel was staring at the screen, his face pale. He could see his mistake now, laid out in black and white. He had shielded the bloodstream, had calculated the half-life, had timed the dosages to avoid detection, but he had not accounted for bone marrow. He had not considered that the toxin would be sequestered there, preserved like a fossil record of his crime. Vasquez asked, Dr. Albright, is there any possibility that this isotope could have entered the victims' bodies through natural means? Albright shook his head firmly. None whatsoever. This isotope is entirely synthetic. It does not exist outside of a laboratory. The only way it could be in their bodies is if someone deliberately administered it. And the isotopic signature matches the lab where the defendant worked. Exactly. We compared our findings with samples from the university lab. The signatures are identical. This toxin came from that lab. The courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors were staring at Jamel with undisguised horror. Jamel could feel the walls closing in. His mind raced. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That is impossible," he shouted. "I shielded the marrow. The concentration should not be detectable." "I calculated the binding affinity. I controlled the pH levels. I accounted for the elimination rate." The courtroom erupted. Bailiffs moved toward Jamel. Judge Thorne's gavel sounded like gunshots. "Mr. Hendrix, sit down immediately." But Jamel was not listening. He was staring at the graph, his hands shaking. "I shielded the marrow," he repeated, his voice rising. "You should not have found anything. I was careful. I was meticulous." Marcus Brennan grabbed Jamel's arm and pulled him down into his seat. He leaned close and hissed, "Stop talking. You are confessing." Jamel seemed to realize what he had done. His face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the jury, and he saw the truth reflected in their faces. They knew. They all knew. Elena Vasquez stood very still, letting the moment breathe. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe the defendant has just provided the most compelling testimony of this trial." The performance was over. The mask had shattered. Jamel Hendrix, the brilliant prodigy, had just admitted to murdering his parents. Judge Thorne called a recess. The courtroom cleared slowly, people speaking in hushed, shocked tones. Jamel sat at the defense table, his head in his hands, his entire body trembling. Brennan sat beside him, saying nothing. There was nothing to say. When the trial resumed, Brennan made a half-hearted attempt to argue that Jamel's outburst had been taken out of context, that he was merely speaking hypothetically as a scientist. But no one believed it. The jury had seen the panic in Jamel's eyes, had heard the specificity of his knowledge. "You do not know how to shield bone marrow from toxin absorption unless you have tried to do exactly that." The defense rested, without calling any further witnesses. There was no point. The case was over. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Jamel Hendrix, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder." The courtroom remained silent. There was no gasping, no dramatic reaction. Just a heavy, oppressive weight of justice rendered. Jamel sat perfectly still, staring at the table. His intellectual arrogance had been his undoing. He had been so confident in his scientific prowess that he had underestimated the science that would expose him. Judge Thorne set the sentencing hearing for 1 week later. Jamel was remanded to custody without bail. The sentencing hearing took place on a grey November morning. The courtroom was once again packed. Jamel entered in his orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his face blank. The performance was gone. There was no more posturing, no more intellectual superiority. He looked like what he was, a teenage boy who had committed an unthinkable crime. Judge Thorne allowed victim impact statements before sentencing. Jamel's grandmother, Evelyn Hendrix, took the stand. She was a frail woman in her 80s with white hair and eyes red from months of crying. She spoke slowly, her voice shaking. "My son and daughter-in-law were the gentlest people I have ever known. Robert taught high school history. He loved his students. Catherine was a librarian. She loved books and helping children learn to read. They were not perfect, but they were good. And they loved their son. They loved Jamel more than anything in the world. She paused, wiping her eyes. They died in agony. The medical records show they suffered for months. Organ failure, neurological damage, pain that could not be controlled. And Jamel watched. He took notes. He documented their suffering in his notebook like they were laboratory animals. Evelyn looked directly at Jamel. You were their son. They trusted you. They loved you. And you repaid that love with poison. I will never understand how you could do this. I will never forgive you. She stepped down, supported by a family friend. Jamel did not look at her. He stared at the floor, his face expressionless. Judge Thorne then prepared to deliver his sentence. He removed his glasses and set them on the bench. He looked at Jamel for a long moment, his expression grave. Mr. Hendrix, this court has witnessed your theater of intellectual superiority for 3 weeks. You sat at that table and smirked at the prosecutors. You corrected the grammar of court personnel. You posed for cameras. You treated this proceeding as if it were beneath you. As if you were the smartest person in the room and the rest of us were simply too dim to understand your brilliance. Judge Thorne's voice hardened. But Exhibit 7B has revealed a truth your so-called genius could not hide. You are a common murderer who happened to know the periodic table. You are not a prodigy. You are not a misunderstood intellectual. You are a narcissist who valued your own ambitions more than the lives of the 2 people who loved you most. He picked up the mass spectrometry report and held it up. This document represents the pinnacle of forensic science. It is the result of months of painstaking analysis by experts far more qualified than you. And it proves, beyond any shadow of doubt, that you poisoned your parents with a toxin you stole from your workplace. You administered it over months, documenting their decline, adjusting the dosage, watching them suffer. Jamel's hands were shaking. He kept his eyes down, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Judge Thorne continued, his voice rising. You sat in that witness box and listened to Dr. Albright explain the science, and you could not help yourself. You had to correct him. You had to show everyone how smart you were, and in doing so, you confessed. You revealed that you knew exactly how the toxin worked, exactly what it would do, exactly how to try to hide it. You said, and I quote, "I shielded the marrow." Those 3 words convicted you more surely than any other evidence in this case. The judge leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You treated your parents like a science experiment. You reduced their lives to data points in your notebook. Subject A and Subject B. Not mom and dad. Not the people who raised you, who sacrificed for you, who believed in you. Just subjects. Just variables in an equation you were testing. He paused, letting the words sink in. Your mother was a librarian. She spent her life helping children discover the joy of reading. Your father was a teacher. He dedicated his career to educating young people, to helping them become better citizens. They were not wealthy. They were not famous. But they were good people who made the world a little bit better every day they lived. Judge Thorne's voice rose again. And you killed them because they wanted you to take a gap year, because they wanted you to develop social skills, because they dared to suggest that academic achievement is not the only measure of a human life. You killed them not in a moment of passion, not in self-defense, not because they harmed you. You killed them because they inconvenienced you. Jamel's shoulders began to shake. A tear ran down his cheek, but his face remained blank. The judge was relentless. Let me be clear about what you are, Mr. Hendrix. You are not a victim of misunderstanding. You are not a genius failed by an inferior system. You are a cold, calculating killer who believed that your intelligence placed you above the moral rules that govern the rest of humanity. You believed that you were smart enough to commit the perfect crime. But you were wrong. He gestured to the prosecution table. You were caught because dedicated professionals, people like Detective Hunt and Dr. Albright and Prosecutor Vasquez, refused to accept the easy answer. They kept digging. They kept questioning. They used science every bit as sophisticated as the science you used to kill. And they exposed you. Judge Thorne sat back in his chair. The law requires me to consider your age in sentencing. You were 17 when you committed these crimes. Some would argue that you deserve leniency, that your brain was not fully developed, that you did not fully understand the consequences of your actions. He shook his head slowly. But I have reviewed the evidence in this case. I have read your notebook. I have listened to the testimony about your meticulous planning. You understood exactly what you were doing. You understood that you were taking human lives. You simply did not care. Your narcissism is so profound, your empathy so absent, that you viewed your own parents as obstacles to be removed. Jamel was crying now, silent tears streaming down his face. But there was no remorse in his expression, only the devastation of defeat. Judge Thorne picked up the sentencing document. This court sentences you to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred to a maximum security facility where you will spend the rest of your natural life. You will never walk free again. You will never pursue the academic career you valued so highly. You will never conduct another experiment, never publish another paper, never bask in the admiration you believed was your due. He looked directly into Jamel's eyes. I hope you enjoy the chemistry of prison food for the next 60 years, Mr. Hendrix, because that is the only chemistry you will experience. Your legacy is not going to be scientific achievement. Your legacy is a graph on a mass spectrometry report, a spike that represents the poison you used to murder your parents. That is what you will be remembered for. Not brilliance, not genius, just cruelty. Judge Thorne brought down his gavel. This court is adjourned. Jamel was led away by the bailiffs. As he walked toward the door, he turned and looked back at the courtroom. His eyes found his leather notebook, still sitting on the defense table where Brennan had left it. The notebook that contained his observations, his calculations, his proof of intellectual superiority. It sat there, abandoned, just another piece of evidence in a murder case. The courtroom cleared slowly. Elena Vasquez gathered her files, feeling the weight of the case lift from her shoulders. She had done her job. Justice had been served. But there was no triumph in it, only a deep sadness that a 17-year-old boy had chosen to become a monster. Detective Sarah Hunt stood in the hallway, speaking with Evelyn Hendrix. The old woman was crying, clutching Hunt's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up." Hunt nodded. "Your son and daughter-in-law deserved justice. I'm just glad we could give it to them." In the days and weeks that followed, the Hendrix case became a cautionary tale. The story of a teenage genius who murdered his parents was covered by national news outlets. Legal experts debated the role of narcissistic personality disorder in criminal behavior. Forensic scientists discussed the importance of advanced toxicology testing. The case also led to policy changes. Oakhaven County implemented mandatory mass spectrometry testing in all cases where multiple family members died of apparent natural causes within a short time frame. The protocol was nicknamed the Hendrix Rule. Jamel was transferred to a maximum security prison in northern Connecticut. He was placed in a cell with another inmate, a man serving life for armed robbery. Jamel tried to maintain his intellectual superiority at first, lecturing his cellmate about topics the man had no interest in. But prison has a way of grinding down arrogance. The other inmates did not care about Jamel's IQ or his academic achievements. They cared only that he had killed his parents, which made him one of the lowest forms of life in the prison hierarchy. Within 6 months, Jamel's performance had crumbled entirely. He spent most of his time in his cell, reading outdated textbooks from the prison library, writing letters to scientific journals that never responded. He had once believed he would change the world with his intellect. Now, he was just another number in the system. Dr. Albright returned to his laboratory in Virginia, where he continued his work in forensic toxicology. The Hendrix case had been particularly satisfying, a perfect demonstration of how modern science could uncover even the most carefully concealed crimes. He kept a copy of Exhibit 7B on his office wall, a reminder that the truth always leaves a trace. Elena Vasquez moved on to other cases, though the Hendrix trial remained one of the most memorable of her career. She had seen many defendants try to talk their way out of guilt, but Jamel's courtroom confession was unique. His arrogance had been so complete that he could not resist correcting the science, even when doing so destroyed his defense. It was a perfect example of how narcissism could be a prosecutor's greatest ally. Judge Thorne retired 2 years after the trial. The Hendrix case was one of the last he presided over, and it stayed with him. He had sentenced many criminals, but few had chilled him the way Jamel Hendrix had. The cold calculation, the complete absence of empathy, the reduction of human beings to experimental subjects. It was evil, dressed up in the language of science. Evelyn Hendrix lived for 3 more years after the trial. She spent that time trying to preserve the memory of her son and daughter-in-law, talking to anyone who would listen about the good people they had been. She established a small scholarship fund in their names, supporting students who wanted to become teachers or librarians. When she died, she was buried beside them, the family reunited in death, if not in life. The leather notebook, Jamel's meticulous record of his parents' suffering, remained in the evidence locker at the Oakhaven County Courthouse. It was sealed in a plastic bag, labeled and catalogued, a permanent record of the crime. Occasionally, law students or forensic psychology researchers would request access to examine it, trying to understand the mind of someone capable of such calculated cruelty. And in a prison cell in northern Connecticut, Jamel Hendrix sat on his bunk, staring at the concrete wall. He thought often about the mass spectrometry report, about the spike on the graph that had destroyed him. He had been so careful, so precise in his calculations, but he had missed one variable. He had not accounted for the persistence of bone marrow, for the way it would preserve the evidence of his crime like a time capsule. It was his only real mistake, he told himself. Everything else had been perfect. The dosing, the timing, the symptom progression. If not for that one oversight, he would have gotten away with it. He would be at university now, pursuing his research, receiving the accolades he deserved. But even as he tried to maintain this narrative, a small part of him knew the truth. He had not made a scientific error. He had made a moral one. He had believed that his intelligence made him special, that ordinary rules did not apply to him. He had believed that his parents were expendable, that their lives mattered less than his ambitions. And that belief had destroyed him. Not the science, not the evidence. His own arrogance. The very trait he had prized most highly had been his downfall. On the wall of his cell, he had taped a periodic table torn from an old chemistry textbook. Sometimes he would stare at it, finding the symbol for thallium, element 81, atomic weight 204.38. He had chosen it so carefully, researched its properties, synthesized the perfect variant. It should have been his masterpiece. Instead, it was his epitaph. The poison that had made him a murderer, preserved forever in the bone marrow of his victims. A molecular signature that would outlast him, that would remain in the evidence even after he died in this cell decades from now. Jamel Hendrix had wanted to be remembered for his genius. Instead, he would be remembered for a graph. Exhibit 7B. A spike on a mass spectrometry chart that proved beyond any doubt that intelligence without conscience is not brilliance. It is just another form of darkness.